Welcome to the Language Hacking Podcast from Fluent in 3 Months.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Language Hacking Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Benny Lewis, and today's episode is one of our short form Ask Benny types. I take one of the questions that you guys have been submitting and I make that the focus for 5 or so minutes of the episode. So today's question came in from Ho Linguiste, who asks, I have heard that learning phrases or sentences is better than learning individual words. Is this true? And if so, do you add complete sentences to flashcards rather than individual words? This is a great question, and it's something that I certainly have to adapt my learning strategy to, because I found if I just learn individual words out of context, then that's not necessarily going to be the most ideal way for me to remember them. I may, in the moment, try to unnaturally go into my mind and think, well, what was that word again? And remember if I maybe came up with a mnemonic for it, which obviously mnemonics are separate to flashcards, but the context was just literally that word isolated. This can be problematic, firstly, because a lot of words can have slightly different meanings depending on the context. But secondly, if you're learning it out of context, you're mostly training yourself to be a walking dictionary. And that's not really what successful language learning is about. And I can actually confess to you that even in the languages I'm most confident in, that I have C-level diplomas in, I would still be a little intimidated at the idea of you walking up to me and saying, Benny, how do I say aardvark in Spanish? Benny, how do I say this word in French? And that's because that is just not how I learned the language. And even for the languages I'm most confident in, I would fail at that kind of out of context dictionary translation, because that's kind of what you train yourself to do if you're just learning those words in isolation. But a true language learner is not a walking dictionary. A true language learner is able to use the word in the right kind of context. So with that in mind, ideally, all your words are in context, but that can be a lot of work when you're creating your own flashcards. So what I like to do is I may not have the full context in the word when I have a session with one of my teachers via video call, and they may be typing into our chat window what the translation of particular words are. In that sense, those words are probably just going to get added to my flashcard decks in isolation. And I have to accept that. But that's my initial exposure to the word, and that's going to help me to maybe come up with a mnemonic and to be able to recognize it. And of course, be able to say it completely out of context. But in a longer term, when I'm really pushing my vocabulary up, that's when I switch to a bit more of the reading style. And there are some tools that let you automatically make flashcards depending on your app of choice, how you use the flashcards. And one tool that I happen to use, which is free, it's called Learning with Texts. Little tricky to set up, but I use that mainly because the language I'm currently focused on, Irish, does not have an association with an app like Link, for instance. Link can be very good for a lot of major languages, but it isn't covered for mine. But one aspect of it is it lets you create flashcard decks automatically, and it'll include the entire sentence for that flashcard deck. So that's one means you can do if the tool that you're using to learn allows you to include the full sentence. But another way is obviously you can just write that sentence, and there are ways in the likes of Anki that you can put things like 2 square brackets around the keyword you're testing for, and that'll be shown as a gap. And this is something you can look into separately, but it has a major advantage that you'll see that word in context. And this is training you that when you're on the spot and you're speaking that language, or even if you're typing the language in a chat to a friend, that rather than performing like a dictionary and just pulling that word out of thin air, because this isn't really how we operate with our native languages, you think of that word in context and it flows naturally with the words around it, because sometimes it's better that there are associations, that you have other words in the sentence that you're more likely to use with that particular word. So it can definitely help, and it just becomes more natural because naturally we use words in context. So just taking bare lists of words by themselves in isolation, this is okay to ease yourself in, but on a longer term basis, you absolutely want to be learning those words in context. It's much more natural. It's going to help you when it has slightly different translations, and it's going to help you to train yourself to use the words in full sentences rather than to become a walking dictionary. So if possible, you can ease yourself into that. Like I said, some tools can help you automate that to a certain extent. And otherwise, you can do a little bit of extra work to include the full sentence if you're creating your own flashcards. And I'm not someone who does this the entire time based off my spoken sessions. I'll do it just for the individual words, but the reading sessions I have, those tend to include a lot more vocabulary learning for me, which is great because that means that most of my flashcards tend to include the full context around the sentence. So that's my general advice for that. It's something you want to build upon. You don't want to focus just on the individual words because the context is everything. I hope that helps. And if it did, be sure to leave us a review at languagehacking.com/review or click in your app that you're listening to right now. And feel free to send us your questions. And if possible, I will try to get to them in a later episode. So thanks so much for listening. Until the next time, happy language learning.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Language Hacking Podcast. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you found this episode valuable and want to help us out, please leave a review at languagehacking.com/review. The Language Hacking Podcast is presented by Benny Lewis and Shannon Kennedy and produced by David Sobel, with special thanks to the Fluent in 3 Months team. The theme music was written and performed by Shannon Kennedy. Find the show notes at languagehacking.com/podcast. Thanks for listening and happy language learning.